Welcome to another edition of World Talks here on TVP World. I'm your host, Benjamin Lee, and please join me and my guests on this next interview. As EU leaders meet in Brussels for the December European Council summit, they face multiple high-stakes debates. How to fund and support Ukraine, shape the EU's next long-term budget, manage enlargement with the Western Balkans, and respond to geopolitical challenges from Russia to migration pressures. Tensions over the use of frozen Russian assets and divergent member state priorities also adds further complexity. Joining us to unpack what this summit means for Europe's future is Garvan Walshe, CEO of Article 7 Intelligence for Democrats. Hello, sir, and welcome to TVP World.
Good evening.
So how would you characterize the political states for the EU this December Council summit?
Well, this is a big summit. British diplomats used to talk about summits being five-shirters. In other words, they might go on 5 days as they thrash out all the different types of issues at stake, and I think this is one of those. There are many things going on, whether it's the frozen assets and whether they can be sent to Ukraine, whether it's got to do with enlargement, as you said, or whether it's got to do with the Ukraine conflict, and even the latest attempt by the United States to threaten European services exports to the US. So there's a lot going on, a lot of things leaders have to focus on. It's going to be a big, difficult set of arguments, and it's going to go down to the wire.
All right, so we'll have to break down some of the points starting perhaps with Ukraine, because we're curious about what are some of the key divisions among member states on the use of frozen Russian assets to support Ukraine.
Well, basically, Belgium is holding out and saying they shouldn't be used, taken from the Belgian Euroclear system, which is mostly in Belgium, which holds these assets. Belgium is worried that these might then be subject to litigation by Russia after the war, and it also wants to use the interest on these assets to plug a hole in its budget. So Belgium is keen to hold on to the assets. It wants to find a different way of funding the war, and it has suggested the use of this Article 122, which is the emergency powers article for financial purposes that the EU has. And it's saying, hey, why don't we use Article 122? That will allow the EU to guarantee member states borrowing for Ukraine, and that will allow this money to be raised by other means. This seems to be where the debate is centering now. Should it be done by transferring the assets from Euroclear to fund a so-called reparation loan, or should it be done using Article 122 of the European treaties?
Right. Do you think these disputes are mostly over legal and financial risk, or is it more of a lack of political will by some countries and looking out for their more national interests?
There are certainly countries like Slovakia and Hungary that don't want to transfer assets to Ukraine at all because they take a pro-Russian position. But when it comes to Belgium, they seem to have locked themselves into this idea that they could use the funds to plug their budget hole and now don't want to give them up. That seems to be the problem they've created for themselves, and they've now somehow been persuaded to find a solution to this particular problem. They came under extremely heavy pressure, including from Germany, who asked them to show solidarity with Ukraine, which after all is due to become a EU member state as it completes the accession process in the next decade or so.
Right. And how significant do you think the Western Balkan dimension is in this year, given the summits on the eve of the council meeting?
It's been an issue. They want to show they're making progress. Montenegro in particular is making a lot of progress, and they're hoping to close accession negotiations with Montenegro next year. If they can do that, then it will be a political decision about when they should be let into the EU, and the EU would be able to show that it is still attractive to new members, it's able to admit new members, and if they can get through the formal set of the process by showing that Montenegro has converged with European Union norms and the European economy, then Montenegro will take a further step forward, and they'll be able to show the EU's health and also show the Western Balkans that attention is being paid to them as well. The Western Balkans were particularly worried that all the enlargement attention would go to Ukraine and also Moldova, and this shows that they're not being left behind.
All right. Now, what about countries like Serbia, who perhaps are a little bit more kind of iffy when it comes to its own leaders' stands, kind of having a more pro-EU rhetoric while we still see some holdouts when it comes to actual decision-making?
Well, in Serbia, it's not just that. It's the attacks on the rule of law, attacks on democracy in Serbia. It's a very Hungary-like electoral autocracy there, and Alexander Vucic has been facing months and months of protests from a student-led movement that has had enough of corruption, enough of mismanagement of the Serbian democracy and Serbian economy by the regime, and they're demanding fresh elections that actually reflect the will of the people. So Serbia hasn't actually been making progress towards EU membership, largely because the government has refused to meet the democracy and anti-corruption criteria that the EU requires.
So I'm looking at these summits and these meetings take place, and one of the things I've been observing is that with the EU enlarging and some of the members not really kind of seeing eye to eye on some of the decisions, do you think eventually there will be an impasse where the constant enlargement and addition of different countries will come into conflict with a need to come up with the unified decisions?
Yeah, a lot of EU decisions have to be taken by unanimity, so everyone gets a veto. The more members you have, obviously, the more difficult that's going to be. So as these members start to join, it's starting to raise questions about how long can we continue with individual states having vetoes over so many areas of policy. Do we have to move more to what's known as qualified majority voting? Roughly speaking, 3/5 majority needed for most EU decisions. So countries can be outvoted, but it's relatively easy to get a few of them together to block something. You don't have simple majority voting in the EU. It's a bit more than that. But if we move away from unanimity, then the process can be more streamlined. However, the process to move away from unanimity itself requires unanimity. Hungary, for example, is not going to give up the vetoes that it has right now.
Right, it's just definitely very paradoxical. And do you think that attempt would even breed more kind of Eurosceptic sentiment, seeing that, well, some of these countries who are perhaps unfavorable to some of the policies will find themselves to be in a position where they feel like they have no say?
That's true, but on the other hand, people also want to see an efficient EU that can make the decisions needed to protect the common interests of Europe. So it's a balance here. Yeah. It's important that we don't get to a situation, like the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, where every member state can veto something and then nothing gets done. And as a result, Europe is unable to conform to live up to the challenges that are facing it, which at the moment are very severe. There is Russian aggression against Ukraine. There is our Russian hybrid threats to many other member states. And now we're receiving hostility from the United States of America. So there are a lot of things on Europe's plate. Can it cohere to be able to make the decisions it needs to strengthen itself and respond correctly?
Right, definitely a very tight balance to be had there. I'm also curious what extent you think the EU's internal politics, things like budget priorities or even migration policy, affect a unity on foreign and security policy.
Well, I think the budget is going to be a big issue because the big question comes how we pay for the agricultural budget, which is a huge amount of EU spending, almost, I think 50%, how we pay for the increases in defense spending, how member states continue to support Ukraine, particularly as it accedes to the EU. These are very big questions, and over the next year or two, there are going to be very fraught budget negotiations. This is also an area which requires unanimity. Every member state has to agree to the eventual budget. So there's a lot of horse trading going to be done. That said, budget negotiations tend to get resolved because everyone has certain priorities, so they can trade off them, and that leads to a very fractious, but in the end, constructive negotiating process.
Right. Do you think this summit is likely to produce meaningful progress on this multi-annual financial framework?
That's exactly the EU budget. I don't think this summit is really where the details are going to be settled. It's going to be a long process. It's going to be carrying on for some months as countries continue to adopt the process of give and take.
Right. You also mentioned transatlantic relations, and of course we're seeing a little bit of deterioration, to say the least. Do you think the summit outcomes could affect that relation and perhaps the cooperation and the format of working together with the U.S. on at least security matters?
Well, we can look at two things on this in security matters. One is the national security strategy that has been very hostile to Europe, talks about civilizational erasure happening in Europe, which it attributes to immigration, and suggests that the United States should work with extreme right-wing parties to try and divide the European Union. On the other hand, there's the National Defense Authorization Act just been passed by Congress with majorities that are immune to the White House veto, and that commits the U.S. to continue to help defend Europe. Troops cannot fall below 75,000. The Baltic Security Initiative needs to be set up to ensure that the United States can continue to defend the Baltic states. So we're also seeing internal conflicts in the United States here. There are two dueling versions of American foreign policy, one carried out by part of the White House and the other one carried out by Congress. They don't see eye to eye either there. There's a lot of internal U.S. politics that goes beyond the Trump administration.
All right, I'm also curious about the Mercosur deal because, well, there's still some kind of debate on that as well. Do you think there will be a conclusion that could satisfy most, if all of the EU countries' conditions?
I mean, the most recent thing that came out was the Italian Prime Minister Meloni saying that she actually couldn't sign on to it this weekend. This seemed to be a route to do with Italian farmers. Again, Mercosur would be an example of the EU showing that it can successfully negotiate with other parts of the world, with markets in China and the United States increasingly closed. The South American market, Mercosur, along with Southeast Asian markets, they're really where Europeans and Asians are going to be able to trade. And if we can't make trade deals with them, the question is, who can we make trade deals at all with?
All right, last but not least, what should Democratic audiences be watching out for in the summit's final communique and decisions?
Well, we need to see whether they can actually either use the frozen assets to fund Ukraine for the next few months or years, or whether there's progress towards using Article 122. That's probably the biggest thing. Let's keep an eye on the Mercosur deal. Can we get that over the line? And of course, has there been progress towards Montenegro's accession there? There almost certainly will have been. That's the easy one. The much harder ones are things like Mercosur, things like the transatlantic relationship, and of course, the use of frozen assets to fund Ukraine. That's really the big one. If Ukraine doesn't get funding in the next few months, it will run out of money. That will pose a huge security crisis for the EU. So this is one issue on which it really needs to get its act together.
Brilliant. Actually, one last thing before I let you go. How would you assess and rate Denmark's performance as the presidency?
I think they've done reasonably well, particularly in using this Article 122 for various measures already. They've been able to get the EU out of a number of divisions. And let's hope the Cypriots continue this good work in the next 6 months.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate it. And thanks for being with us on TV World.
Thank you very much.
Cheers. And thank you for tuning into this edition of World Talks. But for more news, update, and commentary, please stay tuned to TVP World.